Greetings and welcome to Mount Olympus. I am Hercules Invictus, and tonight I am very proud to bring you Witchcraft and Theurgy with the one and only Brandy Williams. Greetings and welcome, Brandy.
Thank you so much, Hercules. I'm so grateful that you are hosting the show, and really happy to help you build out the empire of the Voice of Olympus.
And I'm honored that you are in turn. I'll be here in case you need me. Have a wonderful show, and I'll be here.
Awesome. And tonight our guest is Sara Mastros. Did I say that right, Sara?
Mastros.
Sara's book, Orphic Hymns Grimoire, is just a magnificent workbook talking about the Orphic hymns and how to interact with them. So that's how I came to know your work, Sara. And I'm really grateful that I get a chance to talk to you about this particular thing, Witchcraft and Theurgy.
Oh, great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about it as well.
Yes. And I'm going to mute and clear my throat. I provided you with a set of questions. It's just basically to get us started, sure, to have a conversation. Enough questions that if we run out of steam, we can always go back to the question list. But there are just
between you and me, I'm a talker, so we're not going to run out.
Yeah. My problem as host is to like ask a question and sit in my hands. So I'm sure we'll have a good time. There are two things that really we're talking about, Witchcraft and Theurgy, and one of them is Witchcraft and one of them is Theurgy, and so those are the two that I like to sort of start out with. I mean, my first question is, do you practice witchcraft or Wicca, and how do you describe that?
I definitely practice witchcraft. While I am technically a first-degree Wiccan initiate, I do not generally practice Wicca anymore. Like, it was a stepping stone along my path, and I don't have any beef with it, but not really for me. When I talk about witchcraft, I definitely understand witchcraft to be a craft. I feel like it's right there in the name, right? That it's a thing I do, right? That it's not a thing that sort of I believe or a thing I like be. It's a thing I do, right? And to me, witchcraft is broadly about that the center of witchcraft, right? It's sort of a nebulous neighborhood that I loathe to put firm boundaries on, but the center of it is practical sorcery, right? Speaking things into being, right? Whereas Theurgy, I understand to be broadly about like working with the gods, or I guess singular God for people who roll that way.
All right.
Which I also definitely do.
So you had mentioned that you have an initiation. When you practice witchcraft, how did you get involved in it? What kinds of things did you do in your craft?
So that's a really complicated question. As you might imagine, it's one I get asked in these interviews a lot. So I think some people have already heard this story. And that's that, like, it's really hard for me to sort of put a date on when I like started doing witchcraft. But I remember the moment when I found out that other people also did witchcraft. So I was about like 11 or 12, and my I don't want to say estranged, but my largely unknown grandfather sent me a birthday present. Note, it was like not even remotely my birthday. Sent me a birthday present, which was some book, I don't remember, and a book catalog with like a gift certificate. So like, note for our young listeners, I want to remind you that like there's no internet at this point, and I live in Amish country. So like the books I have access to are the ones that are at our local public library, the ones at the Barnes and Noble. And I will say I was lucky. My mom was in grad school for part of the time I was a kid. So I also had access to the university library, but small local university, right? Millersville University, historically primarily a teacher's college, right? So they didn't have like a huge occult section, right? But I got this catalog. Also, I'm 12, right? I mean, smart, but 12. So I got this catalog, and there in the nonfiction section was a section called Witchcraft. And I knew what nonfiction meant. That meant it was real. And I was very excited because I had always known, I was like, yes, witches, like in fairy tales, that's real. I go out and I talk to the trees and they tell me things, and we like make spells and things happen. I always knew that was real. I didn't know other people knew, right? So that's sort of how I got involved. I was like, Mom, can I buy books of witchcraft? And she was like, they're going to be disappointing, but yes. And I mean, Like my mother read politics when I was like, are witches real? I believe that what she said was, some people think they are witches, which, you know, honestly, when I hear other people's stories about how their moms reacted, great job, mom. And to be fair, that is also how I would describe a number of witches, as people who think they are witches, right? So she was right. The books were like a little bit disappointing. I got 2. Both of them were good in different ways. So I'm glad I got both of them. Like together they formed. And also it's, this story is, let me think, like 1988 to give some context, right? So there just like weren't that many books. So the one book I got, I feel bad. I don't even know what it's called. I always call it Buckland's Big Blue Book of Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo. I think it might be called like Introduction to Witchcraft or something. I can see from your face that you perhaps know the book I'm talking about. It's by Ray Buckland. And I don't know, it's probably in like its 50,000th edition by now. But the edition I had, and I think the edition most people had in like the 80s and 90s, was
The Big
big.
Blue Book.
It was
Yeah,
8.5 by
we call it
11.
Uncle Ray's Big Blue Book. Yeah.
Yeah, right. The Big Blue Book of Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo. Everybody knows what I mean. And that book, is not necessarily a book I would recommend to beginners now, but it was fine. I mean, I got no huge beef with it, I guess. Like, there are things I don't like about the book, but I feel like what I did get out of that book, for which I'm eternally grateful, is basically this. I learned that witchcraft is real, but it's hard. You have to like work to learn to be a witch. You can't just like declare yourself a witch. You have to actually do things and learn things. And then I feel like the most important thing I learned from that book is that witchcraft is available. It is written like between the lines in history and mythology, and you can find it there. And I found that satisfying because that's what I'd already been doing. Right? Like I already knew witchcraft was real, but I didn't have witch books. But I had a lot of fairy tales and mythology. I mean, actually quite a lot. Like my mother was getting a master's degree in children's literature. So I had access to like a lot of folklore from many, many cultures, like more than many kids had, right? Again, eternally grateful. We had a lot of mythology books. Now it's like, I complained about the availability of books, but I mean, I had access to a lot of excellent books about non-controversial topics, right? So I read a lot of classics and all this. That's what I feel like I got out of that Buckland book. The other book I had was called The Encyclopedia of White Witchcraft, or maybe The Encyclopedia of White Magic. It's by Patty Slade. And that book was like, I guess what we would now call like British traditional witchcraft. Sort of, I think she was in some kind of mixed coven of like Gardnerian, Wiccan, and like Wiccan adjacent. That's how I would contextualize now. But again, I don't know. I read this book when I was 12. I don't exactly remember the details. That book was like aesthetically what I wanted witchcraft to be. It was really like rooted in the earth. It was full of like gorgeous nature photos. And it had this idea that witchcraft was like a thing you did in community with people that maybe you had learned from your grandmothers and blah, 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 blah. Right. So like, but in terms of actually teaching me to do things, I felt like it had a lot of interesting information, but it maybe wasn't the like how-to manual I wanted it to be. Whereas the Buckland book did provide some how-to, which was, again, I guess I wanted to do spells, and I was getting a lot of Theurgy, and I didn't object to that. Like I was into mythology, and I understood that to be like what we were talking about, right? And I wasn't, I was brought up in a very sort of like religiously tolerant way. I often say that I grew up atheist, but I don't practice anymore. So when I was little, I would say my dad was like a hard atheist, sort of mellowing into agnosticism. And my mom was like a spiritual but not religious quasi-reform Jew. Right. So I grew up with all that. And I feel like that was important to me. Right. So like I was deeply invested in my Jewishness and my Greekness. My dad's family is Greek. Right. As like cultural inheritances that maybe like had a religious component. But I definitely understood the gods of Greece to be the gods of my father, who his family had like maybe broken up with the Greek Orthodox Church before I was born. Like there's weird. Some of them, I also have a cousin who was a priest. It's like a complex religious history, right? But like my family were involved with the Greek church only in the like food festival kind of a way, right? Which really the best way, in my opinion, right? And I understood like the gods of or the God of Israel to be the God of my mother's people. And that was not problematic for me. Like there was no, that didn't seem like an issue. Greeks and Jews had been doing things together for thousands of years. Jews didn't always approve of it. Greeks didn't always approve of it, but it wasn't like new, this kind of dual faith practice. So like rolling sort of like Wiccan gods into that wasn't a big deal. But one of the things I heard early in my witchcraft career was basically the notion that like you should worship the gods of your ancestors. Well, as a half Jew, half Greek, that gave me a lot of source material. So the truth is, it's not that I don't necessarily believe that, like people should only work with the gods of their ancestors. I think it is a very important, I strongly suggest working with your ancestors. I think that's important. The gods of your ancestors, I don't know, I'm not telling people what to do, right? Especially in cultures where like, look, I grew up with the Greek gods, like even my Christian family, like we talked about that. Those were our ancestral gods. Like everybody knew those myths. They were relevant in our culture. And Judaism, same way, right? Like we weren't religious in my immediate family, but I mean, we were Jewish. And I feel like I'm really sort of happy about that, right? I feel like it gave me a really good place to start. And that sort of took me into sort of like Hermetic Kabbalah from there. You know, I went to school for math. So like that was also a very like kind of analytically detail oriented place. So that's sort of where I started. And then I kind of branched out from there, I would say, both in terms of Theurgy and in terms of witchcraft, which for me, I have generally, for me, they're usually things I'm doing together, though I understand them to be separate practices. Like I certainly understand you can do one or the other, right? But I generally mix them together.
So that's a really great place to bring it back to. And there are a lot of questions that I had as you went through, but there are a couple that kind of I'm kind of hanging on to. So
also feel free to interrupt me, please. Like I'm Jewish. We're an interrupty people.
Oh, I have to say, when you said the Greek gods were your gods, I got a class on Greek mythology in high school, so it's kind of like the Greek gods are everybody's gods, right?
Yes, I think that is definitely, yes, I agree that I think like the Greek gods and the Roman gods, which I think for most people are basically understood to be the same. Like I do not understand them to be the same thing. In fact, I don't even understand the Greek gods to be one thing. Like there's Cretan gods and Athenian gods, and they're all different. But like, yeah, I think that those are like, I think that's for most people in our culture, I think that's sort of their root exposure to paganism, particularly like Indo-European paganism. I think broadly people tend to understand all European gods kind of through that lens in a way that I think does not always do people or the gods well to think of them that way.
So I want to come back to this one little
Please.
piece. You talked about the gods of witchcraft, and we are going to drill down into the Greek gods, I am certain.
Sure.
Just back to the witchcraft one for a second. So how do you understand the gods of witchcraft? Well,
I understand that in sort of two different ways, right? So when I was first starting, one of the things I learned from that Buckland book, one thing that, for example, I do not agree with is, also I want to note that like my first exposure to Wicca, I was fully prepubescent and like late bloomer prepubescent. So there's a real like kind of heteronormative sexual element to the way like the Lord and Lady are understood in Wicca that went totally over my head when I was 11. So I was told that I had to have a he god and a she god. I chose Hermes and Hecate. I understand possibly the queerest couple I could conceivably put in those roles. But I gotta say, like, so I dedicated myself to Hermes and Hecate when I was like 12, and that's been going great. Like, yeah, I'm glad I made that choice that way. That's been going fabulously with me. So I understand gods of witchcraft to mean sort of two separate things. One thing, I think that there is a category of gods that we think of as sort of like the gods of like modern Anglophone witchcraft, right? Where you have like an earth goddess. Sometimes you have like, or like a threefold maiden mother crone goddess. And then you have like a horned god, right? So I think there's that kind of god of witchcraft. There's like maybe a little more ooky spook version of that where you have like the devil, and she of the crossroads, or the queen of hell. That's kind of more where I am, right? Like Hermes and Hecate, don't tell anybody, that's the devil and the queen of hell, like in a different guise, right? But then there's this other category of gods of witchcraft, which is, I think, like whenever you look sort of to any culture, right, you can pick out the gods in that culture that are sort of on team witchcraft, right? And I think they have certain like properties, right, that they tend to share, right? So they tend to be what I would call like a three world walker, right? They are active in the politics of heaven, they are active here on the earth, and they are active in the politics of hell in a way that many gods are not, right? So like many gods are either heavenly gods or chthonic underworld gods, but not everybody's doing both. In fact, in many mythologies, some gods can't, like they're not welcome in some of those places, or they somehow lack an ability. But that ability to travel all three worlds, or however many worlds there are, right, to travel up and down the world tree, however we say it, I think that is a sort of an indicator that maybe that god is going to be into witchcraft. I think being a god of crossroads, which is very similar to that first one, right, which is partly about being related to trade and the intersection of things. It's partly about being related to like liminality. So gods of doorways are also good sort of like suspects as gods of witchcraft, right? But I think something a lot of people miss about gods of crossroads, so I'm going to preach for a second here, is that when you dedicate yourself to a god of a crossroad, you need to be like, that is the god of people who live at the crossroads. Unhoused people, sex workers, thieves, drug addicts, those are the witches. Those are the people of a god of crossroads. And I will say, very little patience for people who claim to be devotees of a god of crossroads, but are like actively poor hating, who are actively hating on sex workers, who are like clearly not in alliance with the people that those gods love. Right. So sorry for that preachiness, but I do think that's a really important aspect for me when I talk about a god as a god of witchcraft. It's that alliance with the people versus the powers that be. Like, I understand witchcraft, unlike Theurgy, I understand witchcraft to be inherently countercultural. Like in all cultures, I understand witches to be countercultural figures.
Yeah,
I don't even know what question I was supposed to be answering
Oh,
anymore.
no. We're the gods of witches, and you did a really good job.
Well,
and it was fascinating too, because you described the gods of the underworld and the gods of the crossroads, which is again Hermes and Hecate. So
yeah, I mean, I have a type.
Yeah, that's it.
And I would not these days necessarily understand those as like my only gods, but I mean, they've always done great by me. So
no, and just coming back to the idea that the god and goddess of witchcraft are gods of the oppressed. That of course comes to us from Aradia. When I came in the early 1970s, we had Aradia, Gospel of the Witches, and she is saying, I am your goddess. I am the goddess of the thieves. I am the goddess of the oppressed. I am the goddess who helps you to overcome your oppressors. So that's really right in line with my understanding.
I didn't come to Aradia, like I already had a pretty well developed witchcraft practice by the time I found Aradia, but like, yeah, that book speaks to my heart.
There you go.
Yeah.
So you've talked about sort of you understand witchcraft to be different from Theurgy. So can you tell me kind of how you understand Theurgy, and then we can explore how those things are the same and different.
So I think Theurgy is a complicated word because I think a lot of people use it in a very technical sense, right? So certainly my first exposure to an understanding of Theurgy was in a Solomonic context, right? So as I was saying, right, like relatively early in when I became maybe dissatisfied with the lack of crunchiness and power hungriness in early witchcraft, which I will say today as an adult looking back was like 80% internalized misogyny. Like I started moving towards maybe like the more male dominated, right, ends of like Hermetic Kabbalah and Solomonic magic and things. And I was, like I said, by nature, I'm like a bookish math person. So I mean, I was good at that, right? I had a little bit of background in Hebrew, I had a little bit of background in Greek, because I like grew up hearing those languages, at least tangentially in the background, right? And so in the context of Solomonic magic, right, we have this basic distinction between like Theurgy and Goetia, right? And so that's the context I first heard it in, right? Which is broadly, to grossly oversimplify. Let me put it this way. This is how I understood that distinction when I was beginning in Solomonic magic. So this is basically the early 90s, right? And I understood basically Theurgy to be like magic with God, by which I meant the God of Israel, but other people meant the Christian God, which I definitely did not understand to be the same thing, nor I think do most Jews understand those to be the same thing, right? We're not supposed to say that part out loud. Right? And like angels, right? And that it was that the power for doing Theurgy was essentially related to being created in the image of God, and therefore like you could sort of command things in his name, right? And then you have this Goetia, right? Which is similarly, right, working with underworld spirits, maybe like fallen angels, demons, that kind of thing, right? And that Goetia, as I understood it, was a less collaborative process. So Theurgy, it was like an employer-employee relationship, right? It was still pretty coercive, right? In the way, truthfully, like as a socialist, I do in fact understand all employer-employee relationships to be coercive by nature, right? But Goetia was straight up slavery. And I will say as a teenager, somehow that seemed okay. Like I didn't maybe think too hard about the morals of things when I was 17. Goetia seemed cool. It was super effective and fun. Like it was all the things that 17-year-olds want out of magic. It was dramatic. It was ooky spooky. Made the Christians hate me even more than they already did. Like I got big, like, I mean, I wasn't getting like movie Hollywood kind of effects, but I mean, it was dramatically effective. I maybe have a natural talent for denizens of the underworld. We have a natural affinity, right? So that was the context I started with Theurgy in. But my exposure to Theurgy, so I guess what I'm saying is my exposure to Theurgy was entirely Christian Theurgy, which I was rewriting into Jewish Theurgy, which, you know, when I started was a quite sort of trivial change. I was just changing the wording. I was just like pulling out Jesus and putting in like Hashem, right? The God of Israel, whatever, right? It was a pretty easy change. But as I got more into the magic, I was also getting sort of more into Judaism, right? So I mentioned that like I had grown up not very religious, but I mean, you know, there's like, it's pretty hard to remain an atheist while you're conversing with angels on the regular, right? Like it was hard to reconcile. Judaism seemed like, I found the Christianity of like Solomonic magic, right? Which is the medieval Catholicism for warlords. Like that's who Solomonic magic as like in like the Key of Solomon that we normally understand. So I'm working with like Mather's edition, right? At this point. In fact, I don't even have the whole Key of Solomon. What I have is a book called Ritual Magic by E.M. Butler, which has a number of excerpts from Solomonic magic. And it was enough. I just filled in the gaps. Like, I don't know. I was Jewish. I filled in some gaps. It was fine. It turns out, I will say, I filled in those gaps with Solomon, which was apparently not what I was supposed to do. But I contend that a relationship with Solomon, Magician King, is the really best road to Solomon power, a thing which apparently not everybody agrees with, which I find baffling. That's my position. So that's what I was doing. I just, like, whenever I didn't have enough to piece together a full ritual, I would just kind of like, well, I am a direct blood relative of Solomon and I command you in his name. And that worked fine, right? So that was my experience at Theurgy.
Let me stop you right there though, because
sure.
You were talking about Goetia and you're talking about commanding demons, and
Sure.
that's what the greater and lesser Key of Solomon do. And Mathers is great, and
Sure.
getting it through Butler is like hysterical. And dropping Solomon in is also really hysterical. So but you said Christian Theurgy, and I kind of
well, I would understand all of those things we just mentioned to be Christian Theurgy.
So, but that's Goetia, right? So the commanding of demons. Theurgy is the commanding of deities, and I have ways that I understand that. But
okay, so When
I
it's
was gonna
used in
explore what you
Solomonic
meant by that.
magic, Theurgy is commanding angels. Like that, to simplify, that's
Oh.
that's more or less what
So you,
Solomonic magic
so you
is.
understand, so your understanding of Theurgy is commanding
Well,
angels.
I mean, that was my understanding at the time. I would now.
Right.
Here's what I will say about Theurgy. I understand the word Theurgy to actually be used in a bunch of different contexts. So, like in ancient Greece, it largely seems to mean divine possession. They appear to mean just like in Bacchic rites where you just become Bacchus. So I definitely understand it to mean that in some contexts. In modern paganism, it seems like it mostly means like working with gods. So I guess what I'm saying is I understand the word Theurgy to mean a bunch of different things. In truth, it's really not a word I would generally use.
So what
I
word
don't.
do you use to
I do
describe
all of
Theurgy?
those things.
Okay.
Like all of those things I just described, I do all of them. The word I most often use to describe myself and my practice is witch or witchcraft, a choice that for me is motivated primarily by politics. Like that thing I was saying about the witch being inherently countercultural, that's why I use a word like witch as opposed to a word like sorceress or magician or occultist or theurgist, or goes, all of which I am. Like I do all of those things. I would not deny being any of those things, but the word I choose for myself is witch, and that choice is primarily political.
So let's talk about the book that you wrote, the Orphic Grimm's Hymnoir.
Sure. You know, it's
Orphic
funny. So
Grimm's
many people do that.
Grimoire.
There
I
you
can
go.
do this. Because it's very interesting. Hercules and I meet with a group of people who identify as we're this little Theurgy like discussion group, and we've been meeting for a number of years. And we focus on that. One of our several of them have done translations of the Orphic hymns and understand Theurgy to be working directly with deities. And so your book, the Orphic Hymns Grimoire, falls directly in that sort of understanding of Theurgy that we work with.
Yes.
They don't so much work with the angels or demons, although I do that kind of magic as well. But that's what they're interested in. So I'm interested in like what got you into the Orphic hymns and what caused you to write that work.
You know, I didn't have the Orphic hymns as a kid. I had like Homeric hymns, but I don't think I read the Orphic hymns probably until college. Where I was reading Taylor's translation, which I like. Like I got no strong beef with Taylor's translation, but as I got older, every once in a while I'd be reading it and I was like, that doesn't sound like something that somebody in ancient Greece would say. That sounds like something a Victorian British aristocrat might have said. So I would like start digging into the Greek, right? Because I was teaching myself Greek at that point. So I would like start digging in, and that was very enjoyable for me. I enjoyed that process of translating, both in like a sort of like fussy technical way, right? Like in a linguistics way, but I also enjoy writing poetry, right? So for me, it was important. I think so many of us in our generation, right? And I think this is starting to be a little less for people coming up now. Like we learned magic out of books. And so I think sometimes the element, there is so much of spellcraft that is about the sounds you make with your breath, like the shape your breath takes as it exits your mouth, right? About the poetry of it, the sound of the words, right? That I think sometimes people who come up from books don't necessarily have. And so I was really interested in like the way they sounded in Greek, right? And they have this meter that is very different than meters we use in English. Like like English does not lend itself to that meter. And there's like there's just a poetry to it. And to me, when I was translating the Orphic hymns, I felt like none of the translations I was reading maybe captured that. So my goal when I was translating was always, I thought to myself, if Orpheus were writing this in 21st century American English, what would he say? Right. And I'm sort of balancing that against, I'm trying to hold as literally the text as I can, but I feel like Athanasakis, is a very good, easily available, like quite literal translation. And I feel like if what you really want to know is literally what it says, you should learn Greek. Like, right? Like I think there's actually limited value. I am skeptical about the very notion that poetry can be translated literally, or that magic can, right? Like, I think you lose a lot of that element, and there's a lot of value. I said there wasn't, but there's definitely a lot of value in those like academic translations. They help you know what a thing says, right? Particularly when you're looking at it as sort of a historical document that's telling you more about an ancient culture, right? But that's not my primary interest in the hymns. My primary interest in the Orphic hymns is as theurgic evocations. And Taylor's, I liked Taylor's for that. They have a meter, like they're poetic. They just, I don't know, they're a little Victorian sometimes. Yeah, they just didn't fully speak to me. So I started making my own, and then people asked me to do more, and then they gave me money to do more. So I did. That's really, I didn't expect that to turn into a book when I started. I was just translating them for me and like putting them on Facebook.
Oh, how exciting. Yeah, and Taylor's language is just an older form of English. So it's
what I mean. Yeah. It's a little harder to like get in the zone with. Or it gets me in a different zone. Like, look, I will freely admit, like, I'm a 45-year-old white lady, and I have a real softness for like a sort of romantic Victorian neoclassicist kind of vibe, right? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, I definitely read Taylor's hymns while I look at Waterhouse paintings. Like, I'm that woman. I get that. But that's not always what I want in like a religious context, right? Where I want some amount of it being ancient. But I mean, I don't live in ancient Greece, nor do I want to live in ancient Greece, which was, at least for women, like not a good place to live, right? I live here and now, and my gods live here and now, and we have a relationship here and now. And so that's kind of those are the hymns I wanted, right?
When you were doing the book, when you were doing the translations, did you do invocations? Did you work with each?
Absolutely.
That's a lot of them.
Yes, and some of them are harder than others, right? Partly because like, you know, some gods are just by nature chattier than others, and some of them are more into things like translation and poetry. But mostly, like, I have a type, right? Like, I have a long-standing relationship with some of these gods. Some of them I don't really have a relationship with, but I mean, they're like my kind of god. You know what I mean? There's a lot of Dionysuses, right? There's like 6 or 7 different Dionysuses in here. Did I have a relationship with all of them? No, but I mean, do I have a relationship with intoxicating ecstatic mania? Yes, I do, right? So like, that's my type. Whereas like Apollo is maybe not a god with whom I have a particularly strong relationship. And his hymn, as you might imagine, for the god of poetry and music in a bard cult, is like particularly hard to translate. So I will say, like, that one I had so much trouble. And finally I was like, your sister though, like I'm good with your sister. She recommended, and immediately, like, that was like, I couldn't make a connection. I went through Artemis. I was like, oh, right. That's how we do this, right? You can piggyback. So then, right, once I was further into the project, I was sort of treating it the same way I was saying with Solomonic magic, right? That I was working through Solomon, like I was working through Orpheus, right? Like, you know, I was saying I went through Artemis, but like all of them, I was going through Orpheus first, sort of, right? And yeah, so it was a lot. I mean, I'm a bit of a god slut. Like, I get around, you know.
I did a year of theurgic practice once where I did the 12 Olympians, and they map out onto the months of the year. And so I just did, it was the God of the Month Club. That's
why there's 12 of them. Like, they're I mean, like, right? They picked out 12 of them in order to match them up astrologically.
Yeah, I think so. And what was interesting to me about that was that there were some deities that I related to like really strongly, and some deities that were really hard. And the great thing about doing a set is that in Neoplatonic terms, they were asked to be well-rounded or spherical. I translate that as well-rounded. That's how I understand it.
I think that's correct.
To confront those deities that you aren't necessarily so drawn to really get a full understanding, I think.
I agree. So I really liked that about Orphic hymns, is that it sort of made me talk to people. By people, I mean gods, that I wouldn't necessarily, I mean, not that I was like avoiding them, but they just weren't really my scene, you know. But I think, I mean, real talk, I think you can tell. If you look through that book, I think you can tell which are the ones I'm there for and which it's not like I don't like them, but like, particularly in the commentary, like, I think you'll notice that I have nothing original to say about, say, Athena. Like, I feel like there are so many people who have like a really strong relationship with her that like I don't feel like I can add anything of value to that conversation. So I think if you look through the book, you can tell. And I think you can also tell who my BFF is, the illustrator, right? Brian Charles. And especially, you know, in the second edition, everybody has an icon. All the gods have icons. I think you can also tell like who his favorites are, right? I think that it shines through. And that's not that like, look, I don't think any of my translations are terrible. I think his illustrations are all good, but I think, you know, like anybody, I think you can sort of feel where they are. But maybe that's not true. You know, from the having written and illustrated them end, it's very clear. Maybe it's less clear on the reader end.
I didn't really see, oh, this one she liked, this one she didn't. I really
good.
saw that you had a good line on each of the forms and each of the essences, and they all work, I think, in theurgic practice to call, because when we're talking about theurgy in terms of an ancient practice, which is kind of where my folk come from, you have to have a way to get at starting with doing that invocation, and the Orphic were a really good start.
Yes, I agree. I think that's really what they're intended for. Like, I believe that to be what they are written for.
Yeah, I think so too. And so one of the ways that people relate to deities theurgically is to relate to statues. Do you do work with Agalma? Do you work with statues?
Sure.
Can you talk about that?
Oh, well, yeah, I'm not sure exactly what to say. I will say, so I actually got a late start in that. Having grown up Jewish did make me a little iffy on statues, right? I kind of held out for a while. I can't, honestly, looking back, I can't even really say why. I just, like, they kind of squicked me out having grown up Jewish. That's all it is, right? Like, culturally, it was a bridge too far. I didn't know how, right? So it took me a while to warm up to them. And when I really warmed up to them is after my grandmother died, my mother's mother, my Jewish grandmother, who I did not have a close relationship with. She was a super cool woman. She was an artist. She was much more pagan than I had been led to believe. Maybe a lesbian. Like, after she died, I went through her stuff, and she owned a lot of Labrys pendants for a straight lady. Like, a lot. She was really cool, and I think in many ways she's one of the people in my family that I think of myself as most like. But, you know, she was also schizophrenic and a child abuser, and I wasn't allowed to be alone with her as a kid. Like, so she never abused me. I barely had a relationship with her, right? But I inherited a lot of her stuff that other people didn't want, including like a lot of large museum quality replica statues, right? Primarily of Greek gods. Some of which, like, I know what it looks like when you pour oil and wine over a statue for 20 years. And many of these statues had clearly been venerated, and a couple of them were inhabited. Not most of them, but some of them were, right? And I'm like, I'd been practicing magic for almost 20 years at that point. I know I can smell an idol when I smell one. You know what I mean? And that's really when I I guess would say, like, started with that practice, right? And people give me god statues a lot. I'm not sure why. Like, I don't know what about me says, like, please give me. I do know why. And I have a weird thing, like, if somebody gives me an idol, I feel like obligated to venerate it until I can find somebody to give it to who will. Like, I don't feel like I can just shove them in a box somewhere. So sometimes I end up with a relationship with a god simply because somebody gave me a statue and I, like, had to venerate it for a while until I found somebody to take it off my hands, basically. Like a foster pet, like, it followed me home and now I'm stuck with it.
All right, I have to ask,
Sure.
There are so many places we could go, but I have to ask you, what's the most challenging deity that somebody came along and just gave you?
Durga.
No,
Challenging,
she's one of
challenging.
mine.
Well, challenging, not like I don't get along with her.
Uh-huh.
Challenging, like I didn't even know who it.
Hercules, are you able to hear me?
Oh, we may be froze. Are you still there? You froze for a
Uh,
second. Maybe I froze.
Yeah, one of us froze, but now we're both here. So you
Okay,
were talking
excellent.
about Durga.
Yeah, so I was just saying, like, I didn't have any cultural background. Like, I didn't even recognize her when I got that statue, right? So that was challenging, sort of in that way. I'm trying. Apollo is maybe not my favorite for reasons that like aren't really Apollo's fault. Like my beef with Apollo is primarily with like Nietzsche's characterization of Apollo, which I understand is, and like Christian Apollo, which I understand are not actually Apollo, but that's kind of the Apollo I grew up with. And also I am a creature of the Underdark and broadly solar gods, and I don't get on very well.
That was a great answer. So you have these statues from your grandmother, and you say, okay, these one or two or three have been animated. They are inhabited, and grandma's been working with them. Do you still have them? Do you still work with them?
Yeah, absolutely. So like, I'm trying to think. All right, I'm gonna show you one, but I want to throw this out there. We all understand that everybody's house is a pit, and they carefully curate a Zoom background. So like, sorry about my messy.
And come back if you want to.
Well, no, let me. I mean, there's ones I can just turn from here. Let me.
Yeah.
There's my mess. So like, there's Persephone up there.
Oh
my. You can see. I think that's maybe the only one you can like see from here.
Mm-hmm.
Right. There's a big Artemis in my bedroom. There's a Hecate by the. Yeah. So yes, I have like. I think that's the one you can see from there. If people are interested, I'll post some photos later when we put this up on the internet.
Okay.
I'll send some photos along of them. For me, I generally work with them. I think of them primarily as sort of like portals, almost like a speed dial to that god. So when I say inhabited, like it's not exactly that I would say like Persephone lives in that statue so much as like Persephone sometimes makes herself at home in that statue. It's like a, it's a place in the physical world that has been given sort of like an artificial environment that is comfortable for her, I guess is what I would say. That's sort of how I think of inhabited statues. I definitely don't. I have forcibly compelled spirits into vessels before in my maybe bad girl Solomonic days. I don't generally do forcible compulsions anymore unless I have to. Like, I mean, if a spirit starts something, I'll end something, but I don't generally like to do that, I guess is what I would say.
And any of us who have done any Goetia have occasionally done something, you did not do what I said, now I'm putting you in this bottle sort of thing, the genie in the bottle.
Yeah, like that, but if you're 17 and maybe not real ethical yet.
Yeah. And to be fair, the Greek magical papyri, which we treat as sort of primary magical and spiritual source, has a lot of compulsion of putting deities into statues. They're like, you're going to get in this statue right now. So that does exist in the tradition.
Yeah, I'm not like opposed. It's just not my scene. I mean, yeah, like the people who wrote that also owned slaves, like human slaves, and I don't do that either.
Right, exactly. But when I do theurgy and offer an agalma, I think of it as an opportunity for the deity to interact, and I don't think of it as a compulsion myself.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
I generally understand it to be an invitation.
There you go. And also a dedication too. So it's a step up in your practice. You read a poem, next thing, offer a statue. And it's sort of an intensification of that relationship for me.
Yes, I think that's usually true. Like, because I sometimes, like, because of my this weird thing happens where I just get a statue. I guess what I'm saying is I start with a statue sometimes because, I don't know, gods sometimes send me their statues.
Yes.
It's hard for me to not, like, geez, I shouldn't have said, people are going to mail me statues now just to, like, fuck with me. I'm sure I'm sure that's what I would do. It'd be hilarious if it wasn't happening to me.
Well, I have to say, almost every pagan I know has a Ganesh and a Kuan Yin somewhere in the house. They show up. These are deities that are like going everywhere in the world, right? So
There is a
Ganesh
Ganesh
in
in
your
I have a Ganesh in my house, but it's not mine. Like
house?
I have housemates, so there is a Ganesh. There is, to the best of my knowledge, not a Kuan Yin in the house, but it's possible that my housemate has one in their room.
So that's one thing that that we think about when we talk about theurgy, about putting or a deity is in a statue. Another way to look at it is deity in yourself, the whole possessory sort of thing.
Mhm.
So do you do that kind of work, and can you talk about it?
I definitely do that kind of work in a couple different ways. So for me, when I do transpossession, I am usually doing it sort of in the context of divination, right? So most of the time, I'm going to get possessed and somebody else is going to ask me questions, right? Which is sort of a core practice in my coven, right? We take turns, right? I also do like celebratory possession sometimes, where it's just like, you know, like a Maynad, right? And I sometimes do, you know, what I think of as like sort of lighter possessory states, like automatic writing, which I do in the context. I mean, a number of those hymns were sort of written in that context, or went through at least one draft. Like a lot of them have like notes like come back when possessed, come back when sober, like back and forth a couple of iterations, you know. They say that the Pythia, the sort of first generation of Pythias at Delphi would speak in perfect hexametric verse, and I cannot do that. So my possessed, you know, here, I do transpossession with a lot of people. I think like being a writer, partly by nature, but mostly just by practice, like I write a lot, I think does the things, my ability to speak or write while possessed is, I think, stronger than many people's, and definitely stronger than it was when it was a beginning. But I don't really understand that to be a magical skill. I understand that to be like, I put words in order for a living skill, right? But I definitely am not speaking in pure verse. Well, usually, sometimes I guess I am freestyling while possessed. That does happen.
And I encourage you to understand that as a skill that's important. I really value it, and a magical skill too.
I agree. Yeah.
Bruce McLennan, who goes by John Opsipeus and Apollonius, recently wrote a book where he did a translation, and he talked about, I really love this. He talked about a state that you can achieve that's not just like I'm putting words together and not the deity is speaking through me, but this intermediate state where your brain is engaged and also the deity is connecting with that.
Yeah, that's what I was.
Yeah,
exactly. That's sort of like maybe one step past like flow state, but if the stage before like automatic writing, there's kind of like a sweet spot in there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, that's lovely. So you talked too about doing this in your coven, and this is something that's in the Gardnerian style of witchcraft, where there's a drawing down the moon, and then the priestess becomes possessed by the deity. And as it has evolved in the last 50 years, then any priest or priestess can work with any deity. We've kind of gone beyond the gendering. Praise be to all the gods.
Yeah.
Right. So is there a specific deity that you work with when you do that channeling with your and I want to say too that if there's anything I ask that you don't want to say because there's a secret or you want to keep it private, by all means just tell me that.
We do a pretty wide variety in my coven. It depends. Usually we'll do like a series, right? So like we did a series of like muse evocations for a while, right? Where people would get possessed by different muses, but not just gods, right? So we do angels. We did a whole series with the angel Arbitel, an angel of revelation. Yeah, and so the way we generally do is we pick in advance, usually. Not always. Every once in a while, I guess only me does this. Like, just stupidly is like, I'm just gonna, like, you just shout out names and I'll play telephone, right? Which is maybe not a practice for beginners, I will say. It is fun but exhausting, right? You know, and everybody's got limits, right? So there are certain deities like One Eye, he's not actually welcome in my house. Jesus, not welcome in my house. And other people in the coven have a couple of other like people that they're, you know, beefing with. But generally, yeah. So I mean, Greek gods tend to be in my coven, it's usually Greek or sort of like Greek adjacent, whatever that means, right? So like Egyptian, Roman, you know, Sumerian, but a lot of times we're using actually like a Greek name for an Egyptian god. And I think that's mostly just because of me. Like, I think I'm the one doing that. Not that I'm forcing it on people, but you know, when it comes up, I'll be like, you know, I got like a whole book of pre-written evocations we could just use instead of anybody having to do more work. So, you know, that comes up.
I was going to ask you about Egyptian gods, actually, because I work a lot with the goddess Seshat. I've got a whole order. The
Oh, that's
Sisters of
fascinating.
Seshat. Yes.
I would like to learn more about that.
We will talk offline.
Yes,
because
please.
we're just finishing so I have a Sisters of Seshat temple that we meet physically, and I also this year we're doing a virtual temple, so I could pull in more people who are like not in my.
Down for that. Yeah.
I'll put you down for the next year's virtual temple. Yeah. But Seshat in particular, because you're talking about being a person who speaks, and she's the goddess whose texts are in her mouth. I thought you must resonate with her. So do you know this goddess?
I do. I know her. I have a special devotion to Thoth. And so like my knowledge of Seshat is sort of in that context, right? Like I'm coming from there. I've had a relationship with Thoth for a long time. I guess I first met him in like that in a Golden Dawn way, right? So the Golden Dawn Invocation of Thoth, I sent away for those audio cassettes. These are on YouTube now, by the way, young people. You should go. They're actually great, right? But there's like a set I mailed away. I saved up money for like a while because they were expensive, and I got this set of Israel Regardi Golden Dawn like guided meditation exercises, basically. They were great, and one of them is an Invocation of Thoth. I will say, warning, when you go look these up on YouTube, look, I understand this is a very provincial American thing to say. To me, Israel Regardi has an absurd accent that sounds like Elmer Fudd if he's trying to be fancy. I'm skeptical that that's what Israel Regardi sounds like. It really sounds like a very affected accent to me, but maybe that's just what he sounds like. I don't know. So warning, he has a strange voice. So that's where I met Thoth. You know, there are a lot of gods that I end up working with because someone else that I'm close, because a co-magician works with them, right? So I also have a very strong relationship with Set because I have a co-magician and BFF who is deeply entwined with Set. Isis, I have a strong relationship with because I had a co-magician who was a priestess of Isis, right? And similarly in some other pantheons, right? So like Freya, I have a close relationship with Freya, despite the fact that I rarely work with Norse gods, like because my necromancy teacher like taught it in the context of Freya because my magical godmother is a devotee of Freya, right? So I think like when you work with other people, sometimes you pick up sort of like idiosyncratic gods that you would not necessarily have a relation, like Mars, for example, Roman Mars. That's not a god I would normally have much of a relationship with, but I have a BFF who's a priest of Mars and a martial artist and also named after Mars. And like, so I have this long standing, like decades long relationship with Mars sort of through him and by him. That by him sounded weird, but you know what I'm saying, right? Like that's who introduced me to Mars, right? And deeply colors my relationship with Mars, right? And I think that's true for a lot of gods.
Well, this has been just absolutely wonderful. And if you can believe it, we've actually been doing this for an hour.
I'm a talker.
No, I just love it. And I think that I really appreciate your coming here. And I'm definitely going to ask you if we can come back to this.
Sure.
Give it some months, but come back to this because
there's
lots of places we can go. Yeah,
absolutely.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. So how do people get in? Let's start with what your current projects are. Are you working on any projects you'd like people to know about?
Let's see. I'm at a sort of a slow spot in project. So I have an introduction to witchcraft class, which is about to end, but will restart probably at summer solstice. I handed in a manuscript. So the next book of mine that will come out is called The Sorcery. Okay. The title might change. It's called something like The Sorcery of Solomon, the Magician King, A Guide to the 44 Planetary Pentacles, or something like that. Real talk, it's weird that I don't know. Like, it's weird that I don't remember what my book is called. It's called something very much like that, but that won't be out until I think probably January. Like the manuscript is with my editor now. So at some point I will get it back, hopefully covered in red ink with a lot of suggestions. So I will make it better. And then it'll eventually turn into a book theoretically in January. I've been working on a translation of Sefer HaOtot, which is a Hebrew manuscript, which may be too grossly oversimplified. Like, I don't want to have a actually conversation in the next 30 seconds with people who aren't here. I mean, I'm not saying you guys would do that. I'm saying somebody on the internet wants to have this conversation. I'm going to say maybe are the source of the planetary pentacles in the Book of Solomon. But again, I have condensed a long, complex history and historiography of a text into 30 seconds. So I'm working on a translation of that with a specialist in Hebrew manuscripts, because it's a manuscript and it's not in great condition. So it's like hard to even make out what some of the letters are. I don't have that kind of manuscript experience that she has. Okay, this video might not be out in time for this announcement to matter, actually. I'm going to be at the Sacred Space Convention in Maryland, April 6 through 9, very soon. I'm going to be at the Welsh Occult Conference in Welshpool, Wales, May. I really should look at a calendar before I do these things. I think May 15 or 16, whatever is the Saturday, like that Saturday around the 15th of May. I'm going to do Witch Fest in New York, I think is in late June. Sorry again. And then West Virginia Pagan Pride in August is sort of like places to see me in person coming up.
Those are not virtual. You're going to be in Wales, actual Wales?
I'm going to be in Wales. My brother lives in England. My younger brother lives in England. So I'm going to see him. And I talked to, the second edition of Orphic Hymns is from Hadean. And they're in the UK. So like I was going to go see him. And I was like, I talked to my publisher. I was like, hey, can you get me some work while I'm there? like, what can I do? And so she set me up with that conference. And I think I'm doing a couple book readings in London while I'm in the UK as well. But yeah, my little brother lives in England, and I haven't seen him since before COVID. So I'm excited to go visit.
Oh, well, safe journey. So if people want to find a calendar of your appearances or contact you, how do they get in touch with you?
Easiest way to find all of my stuff is witchlessons.com. You can get to everything from there, and that's like the easiest to remember. So you can get books from there and classes and calendar, which probably isn't up to date. I should go update it. I'm like, you guys will find when you look at my website that I'm maybe like not the most organized. Once I always ask students where they found me, and sometimes I get responses because usually I can tell there's like a word of mouth. Like most of my students come from word of mouth, right? But sometimes people just find me and I ask, and I get a lot of comments like, well, I looked at your website and I was like, well, she's not one of those Instagram witches. And yeah, that's true. My web design's pretty terrible. So I apologize in advance for people looking at my website. I am maybe not good at that sort of like slick marketing, taking pretty pictures part of it, which is not to denigrate people who are. I'm just not good at it. Like I'm not great at visual art.
Well, we will look forward to seeing your website. Look forward to the new books. They sound fantastic.
Thank you. I'm excited about them.
You know Hercules, and you know that he's got a interview empire of which I am part, and you will be making the rounds on those as you promote your book.
Yeah, absolutely. I quite enjoyed doing these interviews. So I enjoyed, like, this one was fabulous. I like talking to people and answering questions. Like I am not one of those like hermit magic by myself in a room. Like I think co-magicians and colleagues are the best part. Well, a good part.
Well, thank you so much. It's been fantastic. Hercules, did you want to say a few words and give us an outro?
Sure. Just to let you know, this will be up tonight at midnight or
Perfect.
tomorrow at midnight. So it'll be up very quickly. And we had the Witches Fest USA people on right before this show. I did another show and they were on that show. So what you said to promote will be up in time for.
Perfect. Awesome.
And I learned a lot. Thanks to both of you. This was an awesome show. And I look forward to your continuing conversation. This was
Same.
the second one I've been part of, and I'm looking forward to the third and fourth already.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Hercules.
Thank you. And thanks to all our wonderful listeners who will click onto YouTube and listen to this. Until next time, this is us wishing you joyous journeys and amazing adventures. Good night, everybody.